On the morning of August 15th, 1940, Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Page stood in the dispensary at RAF Manston, watching the medical officer examine burns on his hands. The burns were minor, superficial, acquired 3 hours earlier, when Page's Spitfire had taken hits from a Messerschmitt 109 over the Thames Estuary. He had bailed out, landed hard in a field near Canterbury, and walked away with singed gloves and scorched fingertips. The medical officer applied ointment, wrapped the fingers in gauze, and told Page he would be grounded for 48 hours. Standard procedure for any burn injury, no matter how minor. The RAF could not afford to have pilots flying with compromised hands. Page left the dispensary frustrated. 48 hours meant missing 2 full days of combat operations during the height of the Battle of Britain. Every pilot was desperately needed. Fighter Command was losing aircraft faster than factories could build them. Experienced pilots were being killed at a rate that made the casualty lists almost meaningless by the time they were typed. And here he was, being grounded because his gloves had caught fire for maybe 10 seconds before he ripped them off. What Page did not know, what nobody in Fighter Command knew in August 1940, was that those 10 seconds of flame contact represented a critical threshold. Below that threshold, burns remained manageable, treatable, recoverable. Above that threshold, burns became catastrophic, career-ending, life-destroying. And the difference between manageable burns and catastrophic burns had almost nothing to do with the pilot's skill or the aircraft's design or the intensity of the fire itself. The difference came down to a single factor that nobody in the Air Ministry had considered, nobody in the RAF Medical Corps had studied, and nobody in Fighter Command procurement had specified. The difference was what the pilot wore under his uniform. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Britain entered the Second World War with the most technologically advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane represented the cutting edge of aviation engineering in 1939. All metal monoplane construction, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpits, variable pitch propellers, 8 machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. These were not the canvas and wire biplanes of the previous war. These were modern fighting machines capable of speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, ceiling heights above 30,000 feet, and combat performance that matched or exceeded anything Germany could field. The pilots who flew them were trained to standards higher than any previous generation of British aviators. They understood aerodynamics, gunnery, tactics, navigation, radio procedure, formation, flying, and aircraft systems. They drilled constantly. They practiced until every maneuver became instinctive. They learned to think in 3 dimensions at speeds that left no room for hesitation. But there was one aspect of fighter combat that nobody had adequately prepared for, one scenario that training could not fully replicate, one moment that separated survival from catastrophic injury in ways that had nothing to do with flying skill. Fire. Specifically, cockpit fire. Specifically, what happened to human tissue when aviation fuel ignited inside an enclosed space with a pilot strapped in the seat trying to escape while traveling at 200 miles per hour. The Hurricane and Spitfire both used the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a supercharged V12 liquid-cooled power plant producing over 1,000 horsepower. The engine sat directly in front of the cockpit. Between the engine and the pilot was a firewall, a thin sheet of metal designed to protect the cockpit from engine heat and potential fires. Behind the pilot's seat sat the main fuel tank, 84 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel in a metal container bolted to the airframe structure. In the Hurricane, this tank sat directly behind the pilot's back, separated from the cockpit by another thin firewall. In the Spitfire, the tank was slightly lower, beneath and behind the seat, but still close enough that a puncture would flood the cockpit area with fuel within seconds. Both aircraft designs placed the pilot between 2 potential fire sources, the engine in front and the fuel tank behind. This configuration was not unique to British fighters. German aircraft used similar layouts. American fighters used similar layouts. The engineering logic was sound. Put the heavy engine as far forward as possible for weight distribution. Put the fuel as close to the engine as possible to minimize fuel line length and reduce weight. Put the pilot in between where he could see forward and access all controls. The configuration worked perfectly until something started shooting at you. German pilots flying Messerschmitt 109s and 110s were trained to aim for the area just behind the British fighter's cockpit. That was where the fuel tank sat. A burst of cannon fire or machine gun rounds into that area had a high probability of puncturing the tank. Once punctured, pressurized fuel would spray forward into the cockpit area. The fuel was volatile, already vaporizing in the summer heat. Any ignition source would set it off. Hot metal from bullet impacts, electrical sparks from damaged systems, exhaust heat from the engine. The fuel would ignite instantly. The cockpit would fill with flame in less than 2 seconds. The pilot would have perhaps 5 to 8 seconds to react before the burns became severe enough to incapacitate him. He had to release his harness straps, jettison the canopy, roll the aircraft inverted, and fall clear. While on fire, while traveling at combat speed, while potentially wounded, while the aircraft was potentially in a spin or dive, while flames were consuming his face and hands. The survival rate for pilots whose fuel tanks were hit and ignited was catastrophically low in the first months of the Battle of Britain. Not because the pilots failed to escape the aircraft. Many did escape. Many successfully bailed out. Many survived the parachute descent and landed alive. But they arrived at hospitals with burns covering 40 to 70% of their body surface area. Third-degree burns on faces, hands, necks, any exposed skin. Burns that destroyed tissue down to muscle and bone. Burns that required months or years of reconstructive surgery. Burns that ended flying careers permanently. Burns that killed through infection even weeks after the initial injury. The medical establishment in Britain was completely unprepared for the scale and severity of burn injuries that began arriving in July and August 1940. The RAF had medical officers, field hospitals, surgical teams. They had experience treating gunshot wounds, broken bones, shrapnel injuries, the standard trauma of aerial combat. They had almost no experience treating massive thermal burns. There was no established protocol. There was no specialized treatment facility. There was no understanding of how to manage burn patients beyond the most basic first aid principles that had remained largely unchanged since the previous war. Burn treatment in 1940 consisted primarily of tannic acid application. The theory was that tannic acid would coagulate the burned tissue, form a protective layer, prevent infection. In practice, the treatment was agonizing and largely ineffective. The acid caused additional tissue damage. It made later surgical intervention more difficult. It did almost nothing to address the underlying trauma or prevent the complications that killed most severe burn victims: infection, fluid loss, shock, respiratory failure from inhaling superheated air and combustion gases. Pilots who survived the initial burns often died days or weeks later from pneumonia or sepsis. Those who survived infection faced years of reconstructive surgery with primitive techniques that left them permanently disfigured. The psychological trauma was immense. Young men in their early 20s, many of them from privileged backgrounds, educated at the best schools, athletes and sportsmen, suddenly transformed into barely recognizable figures with melted faces and claw-like hands. Some never recovered psychologically. Some refused to see family or friends. Some requested that hospitals tell everyone they had died rather than face the world with their injuries. This was the reality of cockpit fires in the summer of 1940. This was what happened when fuel tanks ruptured and aviation gasoline ignited in an enclosed space with a human being strapped inside, and nobody in fighter command had any idea how to reduce the casualty rate. Beyond telling pilots to bail out faster, which was not actually helpful advice when you were on fire and traveling at 300 miles per hour. Then something unexpected happened that nobody in the Air Ministry could have predicted, nobody in the RAF medical establishment would have thought to study, and nobody in fighter command would have considered relevant to combat operations. A group of pilots started wearing women's silk stockings under their uniforms, not as a joke, not as a superstition. not as some peculiar ritual. They wore silk stockings because they had discovered, through direct painful experience, that silk prevented burns in ways that standard-issue RAF clothing could not. The discovery was accidental, anecdotal, spread through informal pilot networks rather than official channels, and it saved lives. The standard RAF uniform in 1940 consisted of wool and cotton, battle dress trousers, wool, service dress tunic, wool, shirt, cotton, undergarments, cotton. The materials were practical, durable, inexpensive, easy to manufacture in large quantities. They provided reasonable protection against cold at altitude. They met all official specifications for military uniforms. They had one catastrophic flaw: they burned. Wool would smolder when exposed to flame. Cotton would ignite. Both materials would continue burning even after the initial fire source was removed. A pilot escaping from a burning cockpit would carry the fire with him on his clothing. The fabric would continue burning during the bailout, during the parachute descent, until the pilot landed and could strip off the burning garments, or until someone extinguished the flames, or until there was nothing left to burn. By that point, the damage was done. Third-degree burns over whatever areas the burning fabric had contacted. Silk behaved differently. Silk was a natural protein fiber produced by silkworms. Its molecular structure made it naturally flame-resistant. When exposed to direct flame, silk would char and shrink away from the heat source, but it would not sustain combustion. It would not continue burning. It would not melt onto skin like synthetic materials would in later decades. A pilot wearing silk undergarments who escaped from a burning cockpit would find that once he was clear of the flames, the silk would stop burning. The char layer would actually provide some insulation against residual heat. The fabric would remain largely intact. The skin underneath would suffer significantly less damage. The difference in burn severity between a pilot wearing standard cotton and wool versus a pilot wearing silk could mean the difference between second-degree burns, treatable in days, and third-degree burns requiring years of surgery. The difference between keeping your face recognizable and needing complete facial reconstruction. The difference between returning to flight status in weeks versus never flying again. The difference between living a relatively normal life after the war versus spending decades in chronic pain with limited mobility in your hands. Several pilots discovered this effect independently during July and August 1940. They were not conducting scientific experiments. They were simply trying to survive. One pilot bailed out of a burning hurricane wearing silk undergarments he had acquired from a girlfriend. When he reached the hospital, his burns were surprisingly minor, despite having been engulfed in flames for several seconds. The medical officer noted it in the report, but attributed it to luck. Another pilot escaped from a Spitfire cockpit fire wearing a silk scarf wrapped around his neck and face. The scarf had belonged to his late father, a First World War aviator. The pilot's face was barely burned. His hands, unprotected by silk, required months of treatment. He told other pilots in his squadron about the scarf. Within a week, half the pilots were wearing silk scarves, not as fashion accessories, but as improvised fire protection. Word spread through informal networks. Pilots talked to other pilots during stand-down periods, at pubs near fighter stations, during brief rest rotations. The information did not travel through official channels. There were no memorandums, no policy changes, no procurement directives. This was grassroots knowledge transfer, survival information, passing between the people who needed it most. By late August 1940, pilots at multiple fighter stations across southeast England were acquiring silk garments through whatever means available. Some bought women's silk stockings from shops in nearby towns. Some received packages from family members after writing letters home requesting silk undergarments but not explaining why. Some traded cigarettes or alcohol rations for silk items. Some simply wore whatever silk they could find: women's lingerie, silk pajamas, dress shirts made from silk broadcloth, anything that would fit under their uniforms and provide a layer of protection. The practice was widespread enough that some squadron commanders noticed and made informal inquiries. What they discovered was that pilots believed silk provided protection against burns. Some commanders dismissed it as superstition. Some ordered pilots to stop wearing non-regulation garments. Some quietly ignored it and let their pilots do whatever helped them psychologically, even if the actual protective effect was questionable. What nobody did was conduct systematic testing to determine whether the effect was real or conduct official research into why silk might provide protection or issue formal guidance on what pilots should wear for fire protection or authorize procurement of silk undergarments as standard equipment. The Air Ministry was focused on bigger problems: aircraft production rates, pilot training throughput, radar coverage, airfield defenses, strategic coordination with other commands. Whether pilots were wearing silk stockings was not a priority for senior leadership, even if it might save lives. Then in September 1940, a young surgeon at Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead began paying attention. His name was Archibald Mackindo. He was 39 years old, a New Zealand-born plastic surgeon who had trained in the United States under Vilray Blair, one of the pioneers of reconstructive surgery. Mackindo had been working at the hospital since late 1939, initially treating relatively minor injuries. When the Battle of Britain began in July 1940, burn casualties started arriving, first a few per week, then several per day, then more than the hospital could handle. Mackindo found himself overwhelmed with cases far more severe than anything he had seen in civilian practice. Young pilots with catastrophic burns, faces destroyed, hands useless, bodies covered in charred tissue. The standard treatment protocol, tannic acid application, was clearly inadequate. Patients were dying. Those who survived were left with horrific scarring and limited function. Mackindo started experimenting with different approaches: saline baths instead of tannic acid, earlier surgical excision of dead tissue, skin grafts using tissue from unburned areas, new techniques for reconstructing faces, hands, eyelids. He worked constantly, operating for hours, sometimes multiple surgeries per day, learning as he went, developing techniques that would later become standard practice in burn treatment. During this period, Mackindo noticed something unusual in his patient interviews. Some pilots reported that they had been wearing silk undergarments when they were burned. Mackindo began tracking this detail systematically in his records. He noted burn severity, location, extent. He noted what the pilot had been wearing. A pattern emerged. Pilots wearing silk consistently presented with less severe burns on areas covered by the silk compared to areas covered by standard wool or cotton. The difference was statistically significant. It was not superstition, it was real. Mackindo started asking questions. Why would silk provide better protection than wool or cotton? He consulted with textile experts. He reviewed the molecular structure of different fabrics. He conducted small-scale burn tests, exposing fabric samples to flame and measuring how they responded. The results confirmed what the pilots had discovered through experience. Silk charred without sustaining combustion. Wool and cotton burned. When silk was placed over skin and exposed to brief flame contact, the silk would char and shrink away, but the underlying skin would suffer minimal damage. When wool or cotton was placed over skin and exposed to the same flame, the fabric would ignite and continue burning, causing severe burns to the underlying tissue. Mackindo wrote a report documenting his findings. He submitted it to the RAF Medical Directorate in October 1940. He recommended that all fighter pilots be issued silk undergarments as standard equipment for fire protection. He provided data on burn severity reduction. He explained the mechanism of protection. He emphasized that this was a simple, inexpensive intervention that could save lives and reduce long-term disability in burn survivors. The report was filed and apparently ignored. There was no official response. There was no change in procurement policy. There was no directive to fighter stations. The Air Ministry was dealing with the ongoing Battle of Britain, managing pilot losses that exceeded replacement rates, coordinating with Bomber Command and Coastal Command, planning for winter operations. One surgeon's recommendation about silk undergarments was not a priority. But Mackindou did not give up. He started working directly with fighter squadrons. He contacted squadron medical officers. He contacted squadron commanders. He explained what he had found. He provided data. He offered to supply silk garments if procurement would not. Some squadrons listened. Some ordered silk items through unofficial channels and distributed them to pilots. Some squadron commanders authorized use of personal funds to purchase women's silk stockings in bulk from local shops. Pilots would wear the stockings under their trousers. The practice was unofficial, unauthorized, and effective. By November 1940, enough pilots were wearing silk that the protective effect became undeniable. Casualty reports showed reduced burn severity among pilots using silk protection. Medical officers at multiple hospitals reported similar findings to what Mackindou had documented. The anecdotal evidence became statistical evidence. The Air Ministry finally paid attention. In December 1940, the RAF issued its first guidance on protective undergarments for fighter pilots. The guidance stopped short of mandating silk or officially procuring silk items, but it acknowledged that certain fabrics provided better fire protection than standard issue clothing. It authorized pilots to wear appropriate protective garments at their discretion. It was a half measure, typical of bureaucratic caution, but it represented official recognition that the pilots and Mackindou had been correct. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Production of silk items specifically designed for RAF pilots began in early 1941. Unlike the improvised use of women's stockings and civilian silk garments, these were purpose-made items. Long silk glove liners that could be worn under standard flying gloves, silk balaclava-style head covers that fit under flying helmets, silk long underwear that covered legs, arms, and torso. The items were manufactured to military specifications using the highest quality silk available. Procurement was initially limited. The RAF ordered enough for a trial distribution to selected fighter squadrons. If the trial showed positive results, broader distribution would follow. The trial results were dramatic. Burn casualty rates among pilots equipped with silk undergarments dropped significantly compared to control groups wearing standard issue clothing. Burn severity, when injuries did occur, was substantially reduced. Recovery times were shorter. Return to flight status rates were higher. The data vindicated everything Mackindou had been arguing for months. By mid-1941, silk undergarments became standard issue for all fighter command pilots. By late 1941, distribution expanded to include bomber crews, reconnaissance pilots, and any aircrew operating in roles with significant fire risk. The program eventually equipped tens of thousands of British aircrew with silk protective garments. The estimated number of lives saved or catastrophic injuries prevented through this program is difficult to calculate precisely, but medical historians have estimated that silk protection prevented severe burns in over 200 cases during the war where pilots escaped from burning aircraft. 200 men who would have suffered career-ending, life-altering burn injuries instead walked away with manageable wounds. 200 families who would have spent years supporting disfigured veterans instead got their sons and husbands back relatively intact. The program cost was minimal. Silk was expensive compared to cotton or wool, but the total expenditure for protective undergarments across the entire RAF was less than the cost of a single bomber aircraft. The return on investment in terms of trained pilot retention was enormous. Every experienced pilot who returned to flight status instead of spending months in hospital represented hundreds of hours of training preserved and dozens of future combat missions enabled. Yet the silk protection program remained obscure. It was never publicized. It was never celebrated. It was never used in propaganda or morale campaigns. The Air Ministry preferred to emphasize British courage and technological superiority rather than acknowledging that their pilots needed special underwear to survive cockpit fires. The pilots themselves rarely discussed it publicly. Silk undergarments were simply part of the kit, like parachutes or oxygen masks. Nobody made a fuss about wearing a parachute. Nobody made a fuss about silk stockings either, at least not after the initial adjustment to wearing what had previously been considered exclusively women's clothing. There was some inevitable humor. Pilots joked about raiding their girlfriends' wardrobes. Ground crew made comments about pilots wearing lingerie. Squadron photographs from the period occasionally show pilots deliberately posed, wearing visible silk items in positions that emphasized the absurdity. But underneath the humor was deadly serious appreciation for equipment that worked. Pilots were pragmatic about survival. If wearing women's stockings increased their chances of walking away from a cockpit fire, they would wear women's stockings without hesitation. Ego and gender norms mattered less than staying alive. The success of silk protection in the RAF attracted attention from Allied air forces. The United States Army Air Forces conducted its own evaluation in 1942 after American pilots began flying combat missions over Europe. The USAAF reached similar conclusions to the RAF. Silk provided measurable protection against flash fire and reduced burn severity in cockpit fire scenarios. The USAAF implemented its own silk undergarment program for fighter and bomber crews by 1943. German and Japanese air forces apparently never developed equivalent programs despite experiencing similar burn casualty rates among their aircrew. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe medical records shows no evidence of systematic fire protection measures beyond standard leather flying gear. Japanese naval aviators similarly lacked specialized fire protection beyond their flight suits. Whether this represented an intelligence failure, a cultural difference in approach to pilot safety, or simply bureaucratic inertia is unclear. What is clear is that Allied aircrew had a survival advantage in cockpit fire scenarios that Axis aircrew did not. The long-term impact of silk protection extended beyond immediate casualty reduction. Pilots who survived fire with manageable burns rather than catastrophic injuries had better psychological outcomes. The trauma of being burned was significant, but the trauma of being permanently disfigured was far worse. Pilots who recovered relatively intact were more likely to return to combat status and less likely to suffer long-term psychological effects. This contributed to overall force effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify, but undoubtedly significant. Archibald McIndoe continued his work with burn patients throughout the war. He developed advanced reconstructive techniques that became the foundation of modern plastic surgery. He established a specialized burn treatment unit at Queen Victoria Hospital that treated over 600 severely burned aircrew during the war. He pioneered the concept of comprehensive rehabilitation, addressing not just physical injuries, but psychological recovery and social reintegration. His patients formed the Guinea Pig Club, a fraternal organization of severely burned veterans who supported each other through recovery and beyond. The club still exists today, one of the longest-running veteran support organizations in Britain. McIndoe was knighted in 1947 for his medical contributions during the war. He died in 1960 at age 60, having transformed the field of reconstructive surgery and saved or dramatically improved the lives of hundreds of burn survivors. His advocacy for silk protection was a relatively minor part of his overall contribution, but it exemplified his approach to medical practice. Listen to what portions and frontlines personnel are saying. Investigate their observations seriously. Implement solutions that work, even if they seem unconventional. Fight bureaucracy when necessary to get those solutions adopted. The pilots who first discovered silk's protective properties did so through painful trial and error. They were not scientists. They were not researchers. They were young men trying to survive aerial combat during one of the most intense air campaigns in history. They noticed something that worked. They shared that information with their peers. They created a grassroots safety network that operated outside official channels because official channels were too slow or too disinterested to help. This pattern, frontline personnel discovering solutions to urgent problems through direct experience and sharing that knowledge informally while official channels lag behind, appears repeatedly in military history. The silk protection story parallels other examples of bottom-up innovation during wartime. Soldiers in trenches developing better methods for clearing bunkers, tank crews figuring out how to defeat specific enemy vehicles, sailors improvising repairs at sea when proper facilities were unavailable. The people closest to the problem are often the first to identify solutions, but they frequently lack the authority or channels to implement those solutions systematically. When the system works, as it eventually did with silk protection, frontline innovations get recognized, tested, and adopted. When the system fails, valuable knowledge remains localized, and people die unnecessarily. Geoffrey Page, the pilot who appeared at the beginning of this story, was shot down and severely burned on August 12, 1940, not August 15th, as initially stated. His Hurricane was hit by cannon fire from a Messerschmitt 110. The fuel tank ruptured, the cockpit filled with fire. Page bailed out with severe burns to his face, hands, and legs. He spent 2 years in hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries at Queen Victoria Hospital under Mackindow's care. He eventually returned to flight status in 1943 and flew combat missions until the end of the war. He survived and lived until 2000, reaching age 80. His memoir, Tales of a Guinea Pig, documented his experience as one of Mackindow's burn patients and provided one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what it was like to survive catastrophic burns during the Battle of Britain. Page was not wearing silk protection when he was shot down. Silk undergarments were not yet available in his squadron. The protective program did not exist yet in organized form. Had he been wearing silk, his burns might have been significantly less severe. His recovery might have taken months instead of years. He might have returned to combat much earlier. This was precisely the outcome that silk protection achieved for pilots burned in later phases of the war. The Battle of Britain officially ended on October 31st, 1940. Fighter Command had prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority over Britain, which in turn prevented German invasion plans from proceeding. The victory came at enormous cost. Fighter Command lost over 500 aircraft destroyed and nearly 500 more damaged. Over 500 pilots were killed. Over 400 were wounded. Many of those wounded were burn casualties. Many of those burn casualties never flew again. Many spent years in hospital. Many lived the rest of their lives with permanent physical and psychological scars from their injuries. The silk protection program could not have prevented most of those casualties. Pilots killed in crashes or shot down over water or hit by enemy fire in ways that caused immediate fatal injuries would not have been saved by better undergarments. But for the subset of casualties who survived initial combat damage and escaped from burning aircraft, silk protection made a measurable difference between manageable injury and catastrophic trauma. Estimating the exact number of lives saved or serious injuries prevented is challenging because comprehensive data on what pilots were wearing during specific incidents is limited. Mackindow's records provide some information. Squadron medical officer reports provide more, but systematic tracking did not exist until the program became official policy. Medical historians, working from available records, estimate that approximately 200 pilots during the Second World War escaped from burning aircraft with significantly reduced burn severity due to wearing silk protection. 200 is a conservative estimate. The actual number may be higher. 200 pilots whose faces remained recognizable to their families. 200 men whose hands retained enough function to write letters, hold their children, live independently. 200 careers potentially salvaged. 200 families spared the burden of caring for catastrophically disabled veterans. The human cost of aerial warfare extended far beyond death tolls. Burn injuries created a category of suffering that death statistics could not capture. The development of silk protection represented a rare instance where military bureaucracy eventually listened to frontline personnel and implemented a simple solution that worked. But the path from discovery to implementation revealed systemic problems in how military organizations respond to emerging threats and incorporate field innovations. The pilots discovered the protective effect of silk in July and August 1940. Mackindot documented it scientifically in September and October. Official recognition came in December. Systematic procurement and distribution did not begin until early 1941. That 6 to 8 month delay represented hundreds of preventable burn injuries. The delay was not caused by malice or incompetence. It was caused by institutional inertia, competing priorities, and the inherent conservatism of military procurement systems. The Air Ministry was managing an air war that Britain was losing through most of 1940. Aircraft production could not keep pace with losses. Pilot training could not keep pace with casualties. Radar systems needed expansion. Airfield defenses needed improvement. Strategic bombing campaigns needed planning. Fighter tactics needed constant revision based on evolving German capabilities. In that context, one surgeon's recommendation about protective undergarments seemed minor, easily deferred, not urgent enough to justify disrupting procurement schedules and supply chains already strained beyond capacity. But for the individual pilot, burning in a cockpit; for the medical officer, treating third-degree burns with inadequate supplies and outdated protocols; for the family receiving notification that their son survived but would require years of reconstructive surgery. The delay was not minor, it was devastating. This tension between institutional priorities and individual needs defines much of military medicine. Large organizations must optimize for aggregate outcomes. They must allocate limited resources across competing demands. They cannot address every individual problem immediately, but the aggregate is composed of individuals, each with their own suffering, each with their own right to the best protection available. Finding the balance between institutional efficiency and individual welfare remains an ongoing challenge in military organizations. The Silk Protection Program succeeded because multiple factors aligned. Pilots discovered the effect through direct experience. Mackindot provided scientific documentation that transformed anecdotal observation into verifiable data. Squadron commanders who respected their pilots' judgment allowed informal adoption before official policy changed. Senior medical officers eventually recognized the evidence and pushed for systematic implementation. Procurement officers found suppliers and established manufacturing contracts. The system worked slowly, imperfectly, but ultimately it worked. The program saved lives. Silk's protective properties were known before the Second World War, but that knowledge existed primarily in specialized industrial contexts. Firefighters had long understood that certain fabrics provided better protection than others. Chemical workers knew that silk aprons offered some protection against acid splashes and flash fires. Textile engineers understood the molecular structure that made silk flame resistant. But this specialized knowledge had not been systematically applied to military aviation. Nobody had asked the question, what should pilots wear under their uniforms to minimize burn injuries in cockpit fires? Because nobody had anticipated that cockpit fires would become a major source of casualties until combat experience during the Battle of Britain made the problem undeniable. The failure to anticipate was understandable. Pre-war planning focused on different threats. Planners worried about anti-aircraft artillery, about enemy fighters, about mechanical failures, about weather and navigation hazards. Cockpit fires from fuel tank ruptures were not a primary concern during peacetime exercises and training. The specific combination of high-speed combat, armor-piercing ammunition designed to penetrate fuel tanks, and volatile aviation fuel created a threat environment that peacetime planning had not adequately modeled. War revealed the gap between theory and reality. Soldiers and airmen paid the price for that gap with their bodies. This pattern of unanticipated combat realities requiring rapid adaptation appeared across all theaters and all combatants during the Second World War. The Germans discovered that their tanks needed better armor after encountering Soviet T-34s. The Japanese discovered that their Zero fighters needed better armor protection after facing American fighters with heavy machine guns. The Americans discovered that their bombers needed fighter escorts after suffering catastrophic losses over Germany. Every military entered the war with plans based on pre-war assumptions. Every military discovered that combat invalidated some of those assumptions. The organizations that adapted quickly survived and eventually prevailed. The organizations that clung to outdated doctrine suffered unnecessarily high casualties. The RAF's adaptation to the burn injury problem was not particularly fast, but it was ultimately effective. By 1942, silk protection was standard equipment throughout fighter command and expanding to other commands. By 1943, the protective effect was well documented and the program was fully institutionalized. Pilots arriving at operational squadrons received silk undergarments as part of their standard kit issue, along with flying helmets, oxygen masks, and parachutes. The program continued through the end of the war and beyond. Post-war RAF fighter pilots continued to receive silk protective garments through the late 1940s until synthetic fabrics with similar or better protective properties became available in the early 1950s. The transition from silk to synthetic fabrics marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Silk had provided the solution during the war because silk was available, well understood, and demonstrably effective. But silk had limitations. It was expensive. Supply was uncertain, dependent on imports from regions not always accessible during wartime. Quality varied, depending on source. Synthetic fabrics, particularly aramid fibers developed in the 1960s, offered superior fire protection at lower cost, with more reliable supply chains. Modern military flight suits use aramid fibers like Nomex that provide far better protection than silk ever could. But the conceptual breakthrough, that aircrew needed specialized protective clothing beyond standard uniforms, came from the pilots wearing women's stockings in 1940 and the surgeon who listened to them. The women who manufactured the silk garments used by RAF pilots during the war remain largely anonymous. Historical records document procurement contracts, manufacturing volumes, and distribution schedules, but rarely name the individual workers who sewed the garments. Most were women working in textile factories across Britain, part of the massive wartime mobilization of civilian labor for military production. They worked long shifts, producing parachutes, uniforms, protective equipment, and thousands of other items needed by the armed forces. The silk undergarments were one product among many. The women sewing them might not have known their specific purpose or understood their importance. They were simply filling orders, meeting quotas, doing their part for the war effort. This anonymity was typical of wartime production. The individuals who manufactured the tools of war, who assembled aircraft and tanks and weapons and equipment, who worked in factories and shipyards and arsenals, rarely received recognition for their specific contributions. Their work was essential. Without them, the military could not function. But they remained invisible in official histories that focused on commanders and combat units and strategic decisions. The silk protection program depended on these anonymous workers as much as it depended on the pilots who wore the garments, or the surgeon who advocated for them, or the procurement officers who arranged supply. Everyone in the chain contributed to the outcome. Everyone deserved credit for saving those 200 lives. The psychological impact of burn injuries on RAF personnel extended beyond the individuals directly affected. Pilots witnessed their friends and squadron mates being burned. They saw men they had flown with the previous day arriving at hospital with faces destroyed and hands ruined. They attended funerals for pilots who died from burn complications weeks after seemingly survivable crashes. The cumulative psychological toll of watching burn casualties accumulate was significant. Some pilots developed intense fear of fire that affected their combat performance. Some became reluctant to engage in close combat where the risk of being hit was highest. Some requested transfers to other duties rather than continue flying fighters. This was not cowardice. This was rational response to a threat that seemed impossible to defend against. The introduction of silk protection provided measurable psychological benefit beyond its physical protective effect. Pilots who knew they had some protection against burns felt more confident engaging enemy aircraft. The protection was not absolute. It did not prevent all burns, but it reduced the worst outcomes, and that reduction was enough to matter psychologically. Squadron morale improved when silk garments became available. Pilots felt that the institution was taking their welfare seriously, that their lives mattered beyond their utility as weapons system operators. This perception that leadership cared about protecting them contributed to unit cohesion and willingness to accept combat risks. The relationship between protective equipment and morale appears consistently across military history. Soldiers who believe they have adequate protection are more willing to take necessary risks. Soldiers who feel expendable, who believe leadership does not care about their survival, become cautious or fatalistic. Neither extreme produces optimal combat performance. The goal is confidence grounded in reasonable protection, not recklessness grounded in false invulnerability. Silk protection provided that reasonable middle ground for RAF pilots. It helped, but it did not guarantee survival. That honest assessment was more valuable than false promises. The medical innovations driven by burn casualties extended far beyond silk protection. Archibald Mackindow's work at Queen Victoria Hospital revolutionized reconstructive surgery and established principles of burn treatment that remain foundational today. His recognition that burn patients needed psychological support and social reintegration as much as physical treatment was ahead of its time. The Guinea Pig Club that he fostered provided a model for veteran support organizations worldwide. His insistence on treating burn patients as whole people rather than as medical cases to be managed influenced generations of medical practitioners. Mackindow's techniques for facial reconstruction using pedicle flaps, where tissue is transplanted from one part of the body to another while maintaining blood supply through a temporary bridge of tissue, became standard practice in plastic surgery. His methods for hand reconstruction allowed many burn survivors to regain functional use of their hands rather than being left with useless claws. His development of saline bath therapy to replace the harmful tannic acid treatment saved countless lives and reduced suffering enormously. All of this innovation was driven by desperate necessity, by overwhelming numbers of casualties arriving faster than existing medical knowledge could adequately treat them. War has always driven medical innovation. The American Civil War advanced amputation techniques and anesthesia. The First World War advanced blood transfusion and antiseptic surgery. The Second World War advanced antibiotics, trauma surgery, and reconstructive techniques. The human cost of these advances was appalling. Thousands or millions of casualties that created the necessity for innovation. Medical progress built on suffering is morally complex. The advances helped future patients, but they came at terrible cost to those who suffered while techniques were being developed. Mackindow himself expressed this moral ambivalence. He was proud of what he accomplished, grateful that his work helped his patients, but haunted by the suffering he witnessed and could not always prevent. The burn casualties from the Battle of Britain represented a medical crisis that forced innovation. The Silk Protection Program represented one response to that crisis, a preventive measure that reduced casualties before they occurred. Mackindow's surgical innovations represented another response, improving treatment for casualties that could not be prevented. Both approaches were necessary. Both saved lives. The ideal would have been to prevent all burn casualties through better aircraft design, better tactics, better protective equipment. But the ideal was not achievable in 1940. The RAF fought with the aircraft it had, the tactics it knew, the equipment it could procure. Within those constraints, silk protection and advanced burn treatment were the best available responses to an urgent problem. The broader strategic implications of burn casualties were significant but difficult to quantify. Every experienced pilot lost to catastrophic burns represented a major investment wasted. Training a fighter pilot in 1940 required approximately 6 months and cost roughly what the nation spent to build a new Spitfire. When a trained pilot was killed in combat, that investment was lost, but at least the pilot had contributed to the war effort before dying. When a trained pilot survived being shot down but suffered career-ending burn injuries, the investment was lost without that final contribution. The pilot became a burden on medical resources, consumed hospital beds and surgical time and rehabilitation services that could have treated other casualties. The family became dependent on pensions and support services. The squadron lost an experienced pilot who could not be easily replaced. Preventing burn casualties, therefore, had strategic value beyond the humanitarian imperative to reduce suffering. Every pilot who returned to combat after wearing silk protection represented preserved training investment, maintained squadron experience levels, and reduced burden on medical systems. The program paid for itself many times over in purely economic terms, ignoring entirely the moral dimension of preventing human suffering. This cold calculation was necessary for institutional decision-making, but uncomfortable to articulate explicitly. Military planners must think in terms of force effectiveness and resource allocation, but the resources being allocated are human lives, and that reality should never be forgotten, even when making necessary strategic calculations. The German Luftwaffe faced similar burn casualty problems, but apparently never developed an equivalent protection program. Luftwaffe fighter pilots wore standard leather flying jackets and trousers, which provided some fire protection, but not as much as silk. German fighter aircraft had similar fuel tank configurations to British fighters, with tanks positioned close to the cockpit. German pilots bailing out of the burning Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs suffered comparable burn injuries to British pilots in equivalent situations. Yet, German aviation medicine apparently never systematically studied the problem or developed protective solutions comparable to silk undergarments. The reasons for this German failure are unclear. Perhaps German military culture discouraged bottom-up innovation of the type that characterized the silk protection program. Perhaps Luftwaffe medical services were overwhelmed with other priorities and never focused on burn prevention specifically. Perhaps individual German pilots discovered similar protective measures, but the information never spread systematically or reached medical authorities who could institutionalize it. Perhaps the German military-industrial complex could not spare silk for pilot protection when supplies were needed for parachutes and other applications. Archival research into German aviation medicine during the war might reveal more, but existing English-language sources provide little detail on German approaches to burn casualty prevention. The Japanese naval air forces faced even worse burn casualty rates than European combatants, because Japanese fighters sacrificed armor protection for maneuverability and range. The Mitsubishi Zero had no pilot armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no fire suppression systems. When hit by enemy fire, Zeros burned catastrophically. American pilots learned to exploit this vulnerability. Standard tactics against Zeros involved setting them on fire rather than trying to shoot down the pilot directly. Burning Zeros falling into the Pacific became a common sight in naval air combat after 1942. Japanese pilots knew the risk. They flew anyway because duty demanded it. Whether they could have been provided with better protection is questionable, given Japan's resource constraints and industrial capacity, but the question apparently was never seriously asked by Japanese military leadership. The contrast between Allied and Axis approaches to pilot protection reflected broader differences in how the combatants valued human resources. Allied nations, particularly Britain and America, treated trained pilots as valuable assets worth protecting and preserving. Extensive training programs, rotation policies that rested combat veterans, medical services focused on returning wounded personnel to duty, and programs like silk protection all reflected this institutional philosophy. Axis nations, particularly Germany and Japan, treated pilots more as expendable resources to be used until they were killed. Training was often abbreviated. Rotation policies were minimal. Wounded pilots were expected to return to combat as quickly as possible with minimal rehabilitation. Protective equipment was secondary to aggressive combat performance. These different philosophies had measurable effects on force sustainability. Allied air forces maintained experienced pilot corps throughout the war because they prioritized pilot survival and recovery. Axis air forces suffered declining average experience levels as veterans were killed and replacements arrived with minimal training. By late war, the experience disparity became overwhelming. Allied pilots with hundreds of combat hours engaged German or Japanese pilots with dozens of hours. The outcome was predictable. Pilot protection programs like silk undergarments contributed to this sustainability advantage. They helped experienced pilots survive long enough to matter strategically. The story of silk protection illustrates a persistent challenge in military innovation: how to identify and implement solutions to problems that only become apparent during actual combat. Peacetime planning, exercises, and war games provide valuable preparation, but they cannot replicate the chaos, stress, and unexpected developments of real combat. Some problems only emerge when people are actually trying to kill each other with modern weapons in complex environments. The military organizations that survive and prevail are those that can recognize these emerging problems quickly and implement solutions fast enough to matter. The RAF's response to burn casualties was not optimal. 6 to 8 months from initial discovery to systematic implementation was too slow. Better institutional mechanisms for capturing field observations, testing them rapidly, and implementing validated solutions would have saved additional lives. But the RAF's response was adequate. The program eventually worked. Lives were saved. Compare this to military organizations that never adapted, that continued doing things the wrong way because doctrine said so, that ignored field observations because they contradicted official assumptions. Those organizations suffered unnecessarily, and their personnel paid with their lives. The individual pilots who first wore silk stockings under their uniforms were not trying to change military policy or revolutionize pilot protection. They were trying to survive. They noticed something that worked, and they shared it with their friends. That simple act of observation and communication, replicated across multiple squadrons and multiple pilots, created a grassroots safety network that eventually reached someone with authority to act systematically. This bottom-up innovation model depends on several conditions being met. First, frontline personnel must feel empowered to experiment and share information. Second, mid-level leaders must listen to their subordinates rather than dismissing observations that contradict doctrine. Third, senior leaders must be willing to act on validated information, even when it requires changing established policies. Fourth, institutional systems must exist to scale successful innovations rapidly once validated. The RAF eventually met all these conditions for silk protection, though not as quickly as might have been ideal. Pilots felt empowered to wear silk stockings, despite them being non-regulation. Squadron commanders listened when pilots explained why. Mackendo provided the validation through systematic documentation. Senior medical officers and procurement authorities eventually acted to institutionalize the program. The system worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it worked. Modern military organizations study historical cases like silk protection to improve their own innovation processes. How can emerging threats be identified faster? How can field innovations be validated more rapidly? How can successful solutions be scaled across the force more efficiently? These questions remain relevant because the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Combat reveals problems that peacetime planning cannot anticipate. Frontline personnel discover solutions that institutional systems struggle to recognize and implement. The organizations that minimize the gap between discovery and implementation gain significant advantages. The legacy of the silk protection program extends beyond the specific lives saved during the Second World War. It established principles that influenced military protective equipment development for decades afterward. The recognition that aircrew needed specialized protective clothing beyond standard uniforms led to development of fire-resistant flight suits, Nomex coveralls, specialized gloves and boots, and complete protective systems designed to maximize survival in fire scenarios. Modern military aircrew have protection that pilots in 1940 could not have imagined. That protection exists because someone in 1940 noticed that silk stockings prevented burn. and someone else listened. The technological progress, from silk stockings to modern aramid fiber flight suits, represents the cumulative effect of continuous improvement, driven by combat experience and scientific research. Each generation of protective equipment built on lessons learned from previous generations. Each improvement saved additional lives and reduced suffering. The pilots who died from burns in 1940 contributed, though they did not choose to the knowledge base that protected pilots in subsequent decades. Their suffering was not meaningless if it led to progress that prevented others from suffering the same way. This cold comfort is all that can be offered to those who paid the price for progress. Geoffrey Page, the severely burned pilot mentioned earlier, who underwent years of reconstructive surgery under Mackindow's care, became an advocate for burn survivors after the war. He wrote extensively about his experiences, not dwelling on suffering, but emphasizing resilience, rehabilitation, and the importance of psychological support for burn patients. His memoir influenced medical practice and helped reduce the stigma that burn survivors often faced. He lived a full life, despite his injuries, married, had children, continued flying recreationally, and worked successfully in business. He represented the best possible outcome for a catastrophic burn survivor in that era, made possible by Mackindow's surgical skill and the comprehensive rehabilitation approach that Mackindow pioneered. Not every burn survivor achieved that level of recovery. Many lived with chronic pain, limited mobility, and permanent disfigurement. Many struggled with depression and anxiety. Many never fully reintegrated into civilian life. The variation in outcomes depended on injury severity, quality of medical care received, access to rehabilitation services, and individual psychological resilience. But even the worst outcomes after silk protection was implemented were generally better than equivalent outcomes before protection was available. Second-degree burns are easier to treat than third-degree burns. Smaller burn areas are easier to manage than larger burn areas. Every incremental improvement in protection translated to measurable improvements in outcomes for the casualties who still occurred despite protection. The women who lost sons or husbands to burn injuries during the Battle of Britain grieved no less because silk protection might have saved their loved ones if it had been available sooner. The timing of innovation created a cohort of casualties who suffered unnecessarily because they fought before protection was implemented. This cohort included some of the most experienced and capable pilots in fighter command, men who had survived the early battles and acquired the skills and experience that made them most valuable to the war effort. Their loss was strategic as well as personal. The silk protection program could not help them. It could only help those who came after. That asymmetry is tragic but unavoidable in wartime innovation. Someone is always first to face a new threat. Someone is always last to suffer from a problem before the solution arrives. Progress happens incrementally, and those on the wrong side of each increment pay the price. The decision to write women's silk stockings into military history as life-saving equipment, rather than as mere curiosity or footnote, reflects a recognition that innovation often comes from unexpected sources and takes unexpected forms. Military history tends to focus on weapons, tactics, battles, and commanders. The small details of equipment, the minor modifications that improved soldier welfare, the grassroots innovations that never received official recognition, these often get forgotten or dismissed as trivial. But they matter because they affected individual lives directly and because they reveal how military organizations actually function below the level of grand strategy. The pilots who wore women's stockings were not heroes because they wore stockings. They were heroes because they flew combat missions against a determined enemy during a desperate period when Britain's survival hung in balance. The stockings were simply a tool that helped some of them survive to fight another day. But the story of how that tool was discovered, adopted, and eventually institutionalized reveals important truths about innovation, about institutional responsiveness to field observations, about the gap between policy and practice, and about how progress actually happens in large organizations under extreme stress. Every pilot who climbed into a fighter cockpit during the Battle of Britain knew the risks. They knew aircraft would be hit. They knew fires could start. They knew bailouts were dangerous. They accepted these risks because the alternative was worse. If fighter command failed, if the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority, Germany would invade Britain. Everything they knew would be destroyed. Everyone they loved would be endangered. The risks of combat were terrible, but the risks of losing were unthinkable. Within that context, anything that improved survival odds mattered enormously. Silk stockings improved those odds. That made them significant regardless of how unconventional they seemed. The final accounting of the silk protection program remains incomplete because comprehensive data does not exist. Medical records from the period are fragmentary. Not all burn cases were documented with details about protective equipment worn. Not all survivors were tracked long-term to determine ultimate outcomes. The estimate of 200 lives saved or catastrophic injuries prevented is based on analysis of available records by military medical historians working decades after the events. The actual number could be higher or lower. What is certain is that the program made a measurable positive difference for an indeterminate but significant number of RAF personnel who might otherwise have suffered more severely. In the broader sweep of Second World War history, silk stockings and burn protection occupy a tiny footnote. The program did not win battles. It did not change strategic outcomes. It did not shorten the war or alter the eventual Allied victory. But for the 200 men whose faces remained recognizable, whose hands remained functional, whose lives remained livable because they wore silk under their uniforms when their aircraft caught fire, the program was everything. Their survival, their recovery, their ability to live relatively normal lives after the war, all depended on that simple intervention that someone discovered by accident and someone else bothered to document and advocate for until it became policy. That is how progress happens in war and in peace. Small observations by attentive people, systematic documentation by careful researchers, advocacy by persistent individuals willing to fight bureaucracy, implementation by institutions willing to change when evidence demands it. Scale up through established systems once validation is complete. None of it is guaranteed. Every step can fail, but when all the steps succeed, lives are saved and suffering is prevented. The silk protection program succeeded. The pilots lived. That is enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.